I'm just going to spend a little bit of time first going through the layout of InDesign and how we navigate it. So on the top left of the window, it should say something along the lines of new file or create new or create or something like that. Let's click on that. And then we get the new document window. If you've used other Adobe programs, this will be pretty familiar. We've got some tabs along the top, print, web, and mobile. As we click on any of those tabs, then the blank document presets change. So if we're making something and we know that it's going to go only on mobiles, we could click on mobile, and then you'll see that there's things for iPads and iPhones and Google Pixels and all that sort of stuff. Web destinations, pixel sizes. Most usefully probably is print. If I click on print, we're going to get A4, A5, A3, etc. As I click on any of these blank document presets, the values on the right-hand side change. So if I click on A4, I get 210 by 297. I don't have to stick with any of these presets. I can punch in my own values if I want. So if I wanted to print something out square, I could punch in 210 by 210. It's totally fine, but let's stick with A4 properly. We can change the units of measurement. So millimeters, inches, centimeters, points, picus, which are digital measurements. We can change the orientation of our page, portrait to landscape. Our screen's a landscape, so let's just work on a landscape sheet of A4 for now. Number of pages, so if we're working on a magazine or a brochure or portfolio, whatever, we can change the number of pages here. But this isn't a commitment. We can add or remove pages after we've already made the document freely. Facing pages dictates how those pages are presented to us. If we're working on something like a magazine where we have spreads, we want facing pages checked so that we can see them presented to us as spreads. If I had, for example, a 6-page document and I checked facing pages, then page 1 would be shown to me on its own. Then pages 2 and 3 would be shown to me together. Pages 4 and 5 would be shown to me together. Then page 6 would be on its own. So I get that impression of the front and the back cover, and then my interior spreads. If I'm working on something like a portfolio or a presentation where I just want things to be on their own, then I would uncheck facing pages and I would just get stuff shown to me in presentation format. Again, this can be changed after you've made the document. If we go down a little bit, you'll see that we have columns. If we want to have columns to guide us while we're designing things, and the column gutter is just the space between those columns. We have margins if we want to include margins to guide us as well. Even if we do have margins, we don't have to stick to them. We can put stuff outside the margins. We can put stuff wherever we want. They're just there as a guiding tool. Bleed at the end, pretty important. Bleed is supplementary space outside of your sheet of paper that is used as a safety net when it comes to trimming something down. So, for example, if I was going to design an A4 poster and I wanted something on that A4 poster to bleed off of the edge, then I would design the A4 poster with probably an extra 3 millimeters of space around it. So the actual dimensions of that poster would be A4 plus 3 mils all around. And then when it comes to printing it out, it would get printed on a sheet of paper larger than A4, and then it would get trimmed down to A4 size. Because I've designed it with an extra 3 mils of space around it, it means that when it comes to printing and trimming it, there's the 3 millimeter safety net. So whoever's trimming it doesn't have to be 100% on the ball with their trim. Does that make sense? Cool. Industry standard does tend to be 3 millimeters. So let's add 3 mils of bleed to our document, and I'll just show you what it looks like. It's good to get into the habit of just making sure to design with bleed in mind. So we're going to make an A4 document. It's going to be landscape. The 1 page, leave the margins at their default, 3 millimeters of bleed, and let's just hit create. Yeah.
What's slug?
Slug is, oh yes, good question. Slug is supplementary information that can exist outside the edges of the document. For example, if I wanted a little bit of room above each page so that I can leave notes from my printer, print this page on glossy paper, or don't print this page, or etc. Let's not worry about it now. So once I hit create, we get our document. So our sheet of paper is the white rectangle. These pink and the purple lines are the margin. So we left those at the default value of 12.7 mils. I don't know why that's the default value, it just is. And then we've got the red line outside of our sheet of paper, which is the bleed. So if we're ever going to be designing something and something is going to bleed off of the edge of the page, whether that's a picture or a shape or etc., we wouldn't draw that element to the edge of the white, so then we would be using the bleed. It would need to go out to the bleed. Yeah, try and consider that red line the edge of your sheet of paper rather than the actual white, even if that is going to get trimmed off anyways. This is the interface. On the left-hand side, we've got all of the tools. As I select various tools, you'll notice that the control bar at the top changes. If you're working on a small screen or a laptop, you might not have the control bar. If you don't have that, then just go to Window and then check Control. The control bar allows us to change the way that some of these tools behave. So for example, when I select the type tool, you'll see that I get all of these type options. When I select the selection tools, I get other sort of selection options. On the right-hand side, we've got various different panels. Yours will probably look different to mine because you can customize this to what works for you. But don't worry if yours looks different. I'm just going to run through a couple of tools real quick and how they work. The first tool on the toolbar is the selection tool. It's important to note that there are two selection tools in InDesign. There's a selection tool and a direct selection tool. We're not going to be using the direct selection tool at all over the next couple of days. So just make sure you're always using that top selection tool. With the selection tool, I can select things. I can draw selection boxes around them as well. I've got nothing on the document though, so there's nothing to select. So we are going to come back to this. If we skip a few tools down, there's a type tool. And with the type tool, I can draw type frames. So if I click and drag somewhere with the type tool, I'll draw a box to stick some type in. So let's make some type and type something in it. I'm going to click and drag to draw a box.
Yeah.
Once I've got some type in a box, up in the control bar is where I format it. If I want any of the changes that I make up here to affect my type, I've got to highlight the text first. If I want to increase it from, for example, 12 points to 72 points, if I don't have anything highlighted, nothing's going to happen. So I need to highlight all of the text that I'm trying to apply changes to. I'll run through what these formatting options do. On the left, we've got the typeface. So this is where we can choose what our type looks like. It will go through all the fonts that you have on your computer. You can download more fonts online, which I can take you through later. Underneath that, we've got the style. So light, mediums, italics, etc. Not all fonts have all styles. So you might not have some. This one doesn't have an italics option. So again, just depending on the font. To the right, we've got the size. I don't have to use one of the sizes that are in the drop-down menu. I can type my own size in. So if I want something larger than 72, if I want it to be 200, for example, I can type that in. It disappears because my text box isn't big enough to show it. I can just make that bigger with the selection tool. Let's undo that though. I'll make that a bit smaller. Underneath the size, we've got the, let's just change that to something else. Underneath that, we've got the leading for the text. Leading is the space between the lines, indicated by the little icon there. So if I've got multiple lines of text, I can change the leading value to increase or decrease the space between the lines. You can also press or hold down up on my keyboard, up or down, to increase that. If I want to return the leading value back to its default, I just choose auto. Adjusting the leading can be a really useful way to make titles feel more punchy. A lot of the time, if you look at posters, you'll see that they have quite tight leading, which just makes it feel a little bit more impactful and a bit stronger. To the right of that, we've got some icons. We've got this TT, which puts things in all caps. If I don't want to have to retype something in all caps, I can just put it in all caps. Really useful for titles. Underneath that, we've got small caps, where everything's in caps, but the first letter is bigger than everything else. I think this personally looks a little bit funny, but there are some situations where it might be useful. To the right of that, we've got superscript. So I can be Emanuel squared if I want to. Underneath that, we've got subscript for equations. We've then got underlines and strike throughs as well. To the right of that, we've got tracking. So this VA with the arrows going either side is tracking, which is the space between the characters across the whole word. So if I want to bring that in, I can also affect it negatively if I want the text to be closer together. I can set it to 0, back to its default. If I'm working with something that's in all caps, especially if it's also quite bold, increasing the tracking can be quite a good way to make it feel less intense or less shouty. If we just compare that. And just feel a little bit more palatable, a little bit easier to read. Above that, we've got the kerning, the V/A. Kerning is the space between two specific characters. So if I've got a whole word highlighted, I won't be able to change the kerning because it's looking for just the space between two characters. So if I have my cursor between A and N, I can start to affect the space between those two letters. Yeah. This is a very specific way of adjusting type, but it is quite important because bad kerning can make text look quite funny. If I show you an example of some bad kerning in action, this is unfortunate because it's my old uni, but if we look at this header, you can see that the kerning for the text is completely different. The E and the Y are so close they're touching. The O and the N are closer together than the N and the D. The T and the H are closer together than the F and the R. Just lots of weird things going on here. So yeah, really bizarre. Just to show you what can happen if you kern something badly. Some typefaces are designed quite badly, so you may have to kern them yourself, but broadly speaking, you shouldn't really need to. But just so that you're aware, you can use it for interesting design choices. For example, it gives you the nice example of B and A there. So if you did want to squeeze those together, you can get something that looks interesting. To the right of that, we've got the vertical and the horizontal stretch. This stretches things vertically or horizontally, but generally speaking, you shouldn't be distorting type in this way because it always looks bad. So I'd advise you not to touch these unless you really know what you're doing, just to get that they're there. We've also got baseline shift underneath that. Baseline is the imaginary line that all your text sits on. So if I want part of my text to be up, I can raise the baseline, or I can lower it using negative integers. If I want it to go back to normal, just to get to 0. And then we've also got faux italics, or a skew, which basically just allows me to skew my text as well, which can be useful if I don't have an italics option. To the right of all of those icons, we've got the, just make that bold. We've got the fill and the stroke. So the fill of something is just the color. So this top box here, I have some colors. And I also got paper and black. Paper is just white. Registration looks like black, but it's actually all inks printed together. So if you want something to be black, just use black. Don't use registration, otherwise you'll waste your printer's ink. And then underneath that, we've also got the stroke, which is the outline. So if I want my text to be outlined, I can do that as well. I can remove either the outline or the stroke if I set them to none. So at the top, there's a none option. So I can just have outline text if I wish. I don't need to have the same fill and the stroke within the same word, so I can be quite playful. If I want part of this word to be strokes and part of it to be outlines, I can do that. Fun. Let's set that back to black. I've also got paragraph alignment, so center aligned, right aligned, justification, options, etc. You have this in Microsoft Word, so it should be familiar. Once we've got that, let's just head back to the selection tool real quick. So now that we've got something on our document, we can see what the selection tool does, and it allows us to select and move things around. As you can see, there are side and corner squares which allow us to change the size or the scale of something. So I can increase or decrease its size. Like I showed you before, if it's too small to fit the text, it will disappear. But I'll get this little red plus sign, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If I hover the mouse just outside the corners of something, I get these sort of bendy arrows which allow me to rotate something. If I hold down Shift while rotating, I'm locked into 45-degree angles, which makes it really easy to flip something upside down or directly on its side. If I hold down Shift while moving something, I'm locked into moving it at 45-degree angles as well, which again is really useful. If I want something to hug the margin, if I don't have Shift held down, I might be a bit wonky and then leave it slightly out. But holding down Shift just means that I'm going to keep that on a straight line, even if I'm going up and down. And this is a sort of common theme within InDesign. If you hold down Shift, and other Adobe programs, if you hold down Shift, your control is going to be restricted in some way to help you be more precise. Let's move on to the shape tools. So about halfway down the toolbar, we should have the shape tools. Right now, I've got it set to a rectangle, but if I click and hold, you'll see that there are some other tools in there. There's a rectangle tool, an ellipse tool, and a polygon tool. So if yours doesn't look like a rectangle, you need to click and hold on it. So select the one underneath that. It's not the one with the X in it. Yeah. So we don't want the one with the X in it. It's the shape without an X, the empty shape. We'll come back to the one with an X in a bit. Is that running now, Caroline? Nice. With a rectangle tool, we can draw rectangles. If I click and drag, I'll draw a rectangle. If I hold Shift while drawing a rectangle, I'll be locked into a square. And I can change the color or the fill and the stroke, rather, of the rectangle in the same way that I change the fill and the stroke for text. So up at the top, I've got the fill and I've got the stroke for it as well. It's a bit hard to see the stroke because my rectangle is currently selected, but to the right, there's an option to change the width of the stroke. So where it says 1 point, I can just make that bigger. So that's the rectangle tool. If we move on to the ellipse tool, so click and hold on the rectangle tool, there's an ellipse tool, and this allows us to draw ellipses. If I hold down the Shift key while drawing an ellipse, I'm locked into a perfect circle. We go back to the ellipse tool, so click and hold on the ellipse tool, you'll see that there's a polygon tool. And this allows us to draw some kind of polygon. So if I click and drag, I'm going to draw a polygon. Yours might look different to mine. If it does look different, we can change the type of polygon that we draw. If rather than clicking and dragging to draw it, we just click once. If I just click once, I open up the polygon settings. I can change its width and its height. I can change its number of sides, and I can change its star inset. If I want it to be not starry at all, I would change the star inset to 0. If I wanted it to be a hexagon, I'd put in 6, and then it would draw me a hexagon. And then all the shapes that I draw from then on will be a hexagon. Let's grab the line tool. So that's underneath the type tool. It just looks like a slash. This allows us to draw lines. It's important to note that lines are just made up of strokes, not fills, because there's nothing to fill with a line. If I want to change the color of my line, I need to change its stroke at the top rather than the fill. If I change the fill to something, nothing's going to happen because there is nothing to fill with a line. But again, I can change the width of the line by changing its stroke up at the top. If I hold down the Shift key while drawing a line, I'll be locked into 45-degree angles. There are lots more settings that we can do with the stroke of a line. If we go to the stroke window. So if we go to window at the top and then stroke, and this window menu is super useful. It's where we'll be coming back to quite a bit to bring options back up. So if we go to window and then stroke, you'll see that we have various different options for our line stroke. At the top, we've got its weight, so just another word for its thickness. And actually, maybe I'll just draw a longer line so that this is a bit easier to see. We've got its weight, we've got its cap. So we've got a butt cap, a round cap, projecting cap, just how the line is finished. We've got the join of the line. This is more evident with shapes. So if I just select this shape that I've drawn here, you'll see that the join just affects those corners a little bit. We've got the alignment of the stroke relative to the shape. So looking at this shape that I have here, if we consider this blue square to be the actual shape itself, you'll see that the stroke is aligned to the center of that shape, meaning that it's a little bit inside and a little bit outside of my shape. If I want it to be all inside, I can just align it to the inside. If I want it to be all outside, I can align it to the outside. This is very useful. We'll be using this feature quite a bit. If I go back to my line, we've got the type of stroke. I want dashed lines, dotted lines, wavy lines. Very easy to do. We've got start and end points for it. So if I want to put an arrow on one end and a circle on the other, and change the scale of them as well. So it's a stroke window, very useful. Once I've drawn a line, it's not a hard commitment in terms of its direction. I can just pull, or I can rotate it. Once I've drawn it with the line tool, I can, oops. No, I'll come back to that in a bit, actually. Yeah, I can rotate it and move it around once it's drawn, just like any other shape. If we all switch back to the selection tool, we can delete things if they're selected by just pressing the delete key. If it's not letting you select a shape, sometimes you'll be clicking inside of a shape and you'll see that it won't let you select it. And that's just because the shape is only made up of a stroke and no fill. So there's actually nothing inside. I can more selectively delete things if I use the Shift key to select them. So let's say that I want to delete this star and these two circles. I can click on the star and then Shift click. on the two circles to delete them, or I could have done that to just move them around as a group. So shift clicking on things also allows me to add to my selection. Very usefully, if I hold down the Alt key or Option key on a Mac, I'll be able to duplicate something. So if I want to duplicate this hexagon, hold down Alt or Option, my cursor will turn into this sort of double cursor, and then I click and drag, and it will duplicate.
That one, the collection.
That's about all we're going to cover in terms of InDesign's sort of image making abilities, just really simple shapes. Because like I said, you're not going to be really doing huge amounts of asset creation within InDesign. You're going to be doing a lot of bringing stuff in. So graphics, photos, design.